guests tonight are Karen Musalo, who's a law professor, activist lawyer, and has done work since the early 1980s with people who were fleeing the wars in Central America and coming to the United States in large numbers. And unfortunately, conditions persist that are pretty awful in these countries, and people continue to come. She teaches and directs the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies. Has your law school changed its name yet?
Beginning of the year.
Okay, in what is still known as Hastings Law School. And she protects and defends the rights of those seeking protection under the laws of the US. Sara Campos worked with me at MALDEF, but she was not yet a lawyer. She went to law school after that. And she has spent her entire career doing immigrant and refugee rights work at the Lawyers Committee, at NILC, National Immigration Law Center, and now she is with the GROW Foundation, where she is a senior program officer handling their immigration portfolio. So I have so many questions for these two, but I'm going to start with a very broad, open-ended one, and I probably will need to ask nothing further because that will lead to other comments on their part. Is what is different in the Biden administration with respect to immigration policy?
Well, actually, there's a lot that's different, and then there's a lot that's the same. Basically, under the Trump administration, we had a really hostile, government, very hostile to immigrants. And you talked about many of those policies, the zero tolerance, separation of children, you name it. The Trump administration had some 1,000 changes in policy on immigration. It was like the one, he did a lot of things, but he hated immigrants and he hates, and particularly asylum. He saw that as a real threat to the United States. Under Biden, there's still problems. There's no doubt about that. But there's some changes that are beneficial. One important thing that I see is that under Trump, anybody who was an immigrant was a target. The Secretary Holman said, well, if you're an immigrant, you should be looking over your shoulder. We can nab you at any time. Under Biden, that's changed. The people who are targeted are people who have, security issues that are security issues, terrorist types, or folks that people who have committed crimes.
So in the Trump years, we would hear of workplace raids and all of these things. Are those still going on in some places? Do you know?
I have not heard of raids lately, or during this administration. And I haven't heard of, and what I know is that some of the harshest policies have really changed. We don't have family detention the way we saw it in previous administrations. And there are numerous changes like that. The big things that we have wanted, legalization, for undocumented people, those things haven't come about. DACA, some kind of legalization for people with DACA, that hasn't come about. And we continue to be hopeful, we continue to advocate, but these are still major problems.
So I agree with everything that Sara has said, but I want to be a little bit more critical of Biden. So the Biden administration came in, I think, with really good intentions to reverse most of the worst of Trump. And he brought into his administration some people who were advocates with long histories, decades working on behalf of immigrants. So there was a lot of hope. These were people in the White House and high positions in DHS and DOJ. But the people who were afraid of who were aware of how much racism there is in this country and how much anti-immigrant fervor, they were in the administration too and were afraid of political consequences, of reversing Trump. And so the one policy that I want to focus on is, before Trump, it was in our law for 40 years that any individual who shows up at the US border fleeing persecution pretty much has the right to enter and seek asylum. It's international treaty that came into effect after the Holocaust. It's US law. But Trump did what was unprecedented. Using the COVID epidemic, Trump sealed the border. It's a policy you may have heard of called Title 42. Just closed the border completely to asylum seekers. They could not enter. And one of the interesting things is on the campaign trail, Biden never denounced Title 42. He denounced a lot of other things that Trump had done, but he never said he was going to reverse Title 42. It was a #1 ask of advocates: restore asylum, let people enter. And it took him almost a year and a half. For a year and a half, he defended Title 42 and continued it. And it was only in May of this year, I think, if I'm remembering the dates, that he said he was going to end Title 42. But by that point, he had legitimated it as like a COVID policy. And so he tried to end it, and he's immediately sued by the Attorney General of 23 red states. And so Title 42 is still in place. So while there's been good moves for people who's kind of, like my focus, SADA is a much broader focus. So my focus has really been working with refugees my entire career. That's a big one. Like, to shut the border to asylum seekers is huge. And that's one of the things I really have to fall on Biden for. There's more I could say, but our border is still closed to asylum seekers, resulting in thousands, for instance, of Haitians being sent back, just immediately put on a plane and sent to conditions that are unconscionable to send any human being to. So again, it's more nuanced, but Biden's really failed on some of the things that matter the most, to people of Central America and Haiti fleeing persecution.
So when you say immediately put on planes and sent wherever, what rights does someone have if they get across the border?
So, okay, if they get across the border and if they avoid being immediately expelled at the border, then they could try to seek asylum. They have to pass a screening process. And they could be detained for extended periods of time. And again, when I say detained, it's jailed. And I want to just make the point that I think gets lost, because the rhetoric in this country is so xenophobic at this point that asylum seekers are really dehumanized. But we have to remember, it is not a crime to seek asylum. It's an internationally protected right. So to put asylum seekers in detention is jailing people who basically are fleeing persecution, which makes no sense, But that's what happens is that they could be detained and for very long periods of time. Or, and I know, you were probably gonna, get to this, or they could be used as political pawns, as we've seen, Abbott in Texas, Ducey in Arizona, DeSantis in Florida, just using human beings, dehumanizing them to such an extent, and using them just to make political points
Right, shipping plane loads of people to places like Martha's Vineyard. Is that legal?
Well,
So,
they've been sued.
yeah.
DeSantis has been sued by the Lawyers Committee in Boston. We'll see. Lots of things have been coming out about what people were told. Many of them were told under false pretenses that they were going to get jobs, they were going to Boston. No one said anything about Martha's Vineyard, So, I've seen some of the reports, and I think it depends on what people have been told, and we'll see how the courts handle that.
But the beauty of that is that these governors were trying to further dehumanize asylum seekers by shipping them, and the hospitality and the welcome that the asylum seekers have received is really shows this stark divide in our society. you know, that there are just so many good people who don't want this kind of, you know, xenophobia, racism, dehumanization. And that's kind of the hope and the struggle, is that the forces of good are stronger than the, you know.
Our government always resorts to deterrence, you know, with detention, even with, you know, the zero tolerance. It's, you know, that what you said during your show, that, you know, if we make life hard enough, people won't come. And that has never worked. It is never, you know, and academics who study this say, this is wrong. This is not gonna work. And yet we always resort to it. And within the administration, there are people who still resort to that. You know, within the administration, there's been, you know, tension and conflict within the Biden administration of, you know, people who, you know, some of our friends, you know, advocates that, you know, people who've been immigration advocates, and then people who, you know, have different ways of thinking about immigrants, and that deterrence is something people resort to, and it just never works, and never will.
But you know, one thing I think that's really important, we've seen how the right uses fear. And so this language of invasion, which has these horrific consequences of the kinds of massacres that we saw at the supermarket in El Paso. So trying to portray this as an invasion or a crisis at the border. But if we actually look, I want to just give you two statistics that I think will sort of belie this picture of like, this is more than this country can take. There were very high numbers of attempted entries at the US border this year, and everybody's focused on like, oh, huge numbers. The number of people who came to the border is less than, it's about 0.6, it's 0.6% of what the US population is. So in 1 year. So to think that a country this big can't accept asylum seekers that equal like 0.6%. And the other statistic I just want to tell you, there's something like about 100 million refugees and displaced persons globally, and about 85% of them are housed in lower income, hosted in lower income and middle income countries. So highly industrialized, wealthy countries like the US collectively only take 15% of the world's refugees. So when you hear these stories about us being like invaded, inundated, we can't, like, we're such good guys, we can't take them all. It's like, hey, we're not even taking like a fraction. So I think it's so important to meet like the myths and what like whips up the fear with facts. Now some people you won't convince with facts, it doesn't matter how many facts, because they have their alternate reality. But there's that slice of people maybe in the middle that will listen to the facts.
The other interesting thing is that research shows that the most vibrant, most successful places in the United States are communities that have a large number of immigrants, right? There's more jobs being created, there's more, all kinds of good things.
That's the other thing that that's important to mention, that, you know, we're kind of, we're not even helping ourselves. You know, we have right now a labor shortage, you know, some food shortages, and we can't pass a farm worker law, you know, because we're so polarized. We can't pass some legalization for DACA recipients, even though industries need people. They need immigrants to take these jobs, and we can't even help ourselves because of this rhetoric that's pervasive, or that polarizes people. The other point I want to make is that we constantly hear about the chaos at the border, and if you really look at it, is it chaotic? Is it chaotic because there's so many people coming? And some of the numbers that Karen's talking about and that we've seen in the news, those are people that are counted once, twice, 3 times, because of Title 42 doesn't have a deportation consequence. It hasn't, you know, people get expelled, but they're not counted as deportations. So people try and come back and forth many times, and so those numbers all get added up, and the number is far lower than the millions that are being portrayed. So.
What's happening with DACA recipients? I mean, it seems like they're in a state of limbo.
They are.
And for how many years can that go on?
DACA was issued in 2012, and people have gone to school, have entered careers. People can't move on with their lives. They can't get married, because they're worried. Like, I may have to go home, or I may not be able to support a family, or it's basically what's just happened. If people haven't heard this, the Fifth Circuit just issued a ruling on DACA. No surprise, it's a very conservative court, but essentially saying that it's illegal. There's a new issue. One of the reasons that it was deemed illegal is because the states said that Biden hadn't gone through the Administrative Procedure Act, which is sort of it's required whenever you issue a regulation. But he actually did, his administration actually did issue a regulation, and so the judge is going to have to consider that when what happens after the Fifth Circuit rules. It goes back to the original judge, who is no friend to DACA, but he's going to have to consider whether that regulation passes muster under the Administrative Procedure Act.
And I want to say something about the courts, because I think what Sara is, focusing on what the courts have done in DACA, but it's an example of, the Trump administration appointed a lot of judges. And I don't think anybody can pretend, like as a lawyer, and I'm trying to teach law students, and convince them that they can do good by being, but it's really hard to believe that when we've just seen decisions during Trump and now during Biden, like there was nothing too outrageous or unlawful that Trump could do that the courts wouldn't uphold. Ban Muslims, fine, that's not religious persecution, right? But no matter what Biden does, the courts say he doesn't have the authority to do it. And I don't think, it's not an exaggeration. This is like, I have a colleague who just published an article that's just like talking about the corruption of and the sort of kneecapping of any immigration policy by these judges that are so corrupt. So we have a real struggle. We need to keep the House, get more judges in the Senate, change the courts. Because it's, all of us up here, we're lawyers because we think it can, be a tool for justice, but it's hard when the people who are supposed to be the neutral arbiters are absolutely so biased that it's, it's very disillusioning.
Thank you. People often say, well, it's not that I'm against immigrants, but they should just come in legally, right? They should stand in line.
But
the way my
line.
ancestors did, right? The way my ancestors did.
There's no line. And if there is a line, it's illusory, right? The numbers of ways that people can actually, legalize here are really limited. If there are three main ways, right? There's family visas, there freedom, persecution, asylum, and humanitarian rules, and then there's employment visas. And there's a smattering of others for exceptional people, diversity visas, people who want to come in with $1 million or $10 million and invest. But if you look at the main ones, like the family visas, if you want to, bring in your brother or your sister, you might have to wait 20 years, for that person's visa to go through. That's illusory. That's not real.
Yet you hear that all the time.
There's no line.
Well, and for asylum seekers, it's just wrong, because the law directly expressly says you can show up at the border and ask for protection. So these people who say that that's unlawful, they don't understand. And for the other, what Sara just said, it's true. For other forms of immigrating legally, the system is so backlogged and under-resourced, and the design in the system so bad. And so what we need to have is a major legalization. Most countries around the world don't keep people in this, status of being unlawful for so long. Last time we had a legalization was in 1986, right? So 96, 2000. 30-something years ago. There are countries like Spain or Portugal, every number of years, incrementally, they say, we have this population that's undocumented. These are people living here, they've put down roots, let's have a legalization. So this country is really exceptional in the bad sense of just keeping this population without any rights for such, extreme period of time.
And the majority of those folks are have set roots. They've been living here 10 years and more. They have kids. They live in mixed status families, right? Because the kids might be citizens and the parents might not, or one parent may be here legally and the other one isn't. And they live in fear of deportation, of being separated. So it's a real problem, and they can't vote. They don't have the same sorts of rights that we citizens have.
Well, I would like to give you all an opportunity to ask questions, if you have any.
Give us something to look forward to.
Well, I think that we shouldn't believe everything we read about the polls. I think, the Dobbs decision and ending the right to abortion has mobilized people, and I think we need, personally, my own, and I encourage it, we need to work as hard as we can in whatever way our own personal resources and abilities, to hold the House and increase the margin in the Senate, because there are good ideas out there to do things on immigration that would make a huge, huge difference. But we need to have the Congress to really do it. And so for me, the good things are like, let's work hard and not be like resigned to what the pundits tell us that it's going to be like a red wave. Let's make it a blue wave. And so then there's real hope for change.
One thing that's interesting is that while the federal government is at a standstill in terms of any sort of policy change, there are states and localities, local cities and counties that are doing things, passing IDs for undocumented folks, in-state tuition. There's now a measure in Arizona that's on the ballot now that would give in-state tuition on parity for Dreamers. And just a few years ago, you were talking about the Show Me Your Papers laws, right? And so that's change, and it's coming about because there's organizing, there's civic engagement, and if these young people and their families and people come out for that, we might have some good Democratic leaders in that state. So we have a friend who looks at state and local changes, and it's incremental, but it is happening. So how about that?
Yes,
To what
Diane.
extent are there prohibitions against hiring illegal people who are not documented as an employment, hiring them? Are they still fully enforced? And I just remember for so long, if you weren't a citizen, you couldn't get a job. Is that still pretty much the case?
Well, those laws are still in the books for
Yeah.
sure, right? But as we know, that many of what it comes down to is enforcement, right? And I have not heard, as I've not heard of mass raids, and that's connected to, whether, rating employers and figuring out who's hiring a lot of undocumented. I haven't heard of that much enforcement. I don't know if it's happening in farm work as much. So I really don't have any information about that, but I do know that those laws are still in the books.
And I think what happens as a consequence is that if people don't have legal permission to work, they're more subject to being exploited, right? Because they know that they can be turned in for that. And so even if, I mean, I agree with Sada, I don't think there are these large scale raids, but we've created this permanent sort of underclass of workers who are really, you know, very vulnerable to exploitation.
I know of a young woman who basically, she was undocumented. She graduated from Berkeley. She and like 6 other Latinas lived together, and they all worked at Subway. And then all of a sudden, Subway changed their rules, and they lost their jobs. And there's the story of what happened to this one woman. It's just so tragic.
You know, one of the things that, I was just gonna say that one of, an organization locally called Immigrants Rising has spent a lot of time thinking of and about how can undocumented people work together collectively, you know, and not necessarily, you know, be hired at a place where you're required to have a social security card. You know, we're probably going to need to do more of that. Figure out ways for people to, you know, to work on their own, you know, and immigrants have always been great entrepreneurs.
Right. And one question is whether they can pay self-employment tax and build up some social security rights.
And people who are undocumented, you know, pay taxes and
Yes, huge amounts.
yeah,
Yes.
like all the rest of us.
Like the rest of us, right? Any other questions? Yeah,
The children that are still at the border, what's being done to either identify them, find their families, you know, and how long they've been there? Some children.
You talking about the kids that were separated from their families? There's a task force under Biden that is working to reunite families.
but it was truly outrageous when they were separating children from their families. They weren't tracking, they weren't, they track widgets better in the government than they did with these kids. And some of these kids didn't yet know their names. It's just been horrendous. That would never have happened if these were white kids.
It was
Never.
I mean, it was really intentional to result in permanent separation. And the task force has done really a great job. It's, again, somebody who's an activist for many years on behalf of women and children who was appointed to head up the task force. And they've gone like village to village and towns in the countries in Guatemala, like trying to track down families. But when you don't have any, as Irma said, like there was no effort to keep records. In fact, the opposite was true. Let's not keep records. It's just been daunting. So as Irma said, I think there's still at least 700 that are still separated.
And in the early stages of the cases that were filed, the government said, we don't know how to find them. It was the ACLU and other advocates that were doing all the groundwork to help identify who these people were. And I believe that there are some lawsuits against the government by the families who were.
Right, so let me add, you know, this is where, and I know I'm sounding awful negative on Biden, but, you know, and I actually think he's done a good job on a lot of issues other than immigration, but, so Biden acknowledged when the family, he denounced, as any good human being would, the family separation, and he said these families should be compensated. And so, as Irma said, there were lawsuits actually against the government by the families for the emotional harm of the suffering and the trauma. And so these lawsuits, Biden had said these families should be compensated, and the Justice Department started negotiating with the attorneys, and they actually were going to offer the families $450,000 each for the incredible suffering that they had endured. And it leaked that amount was being negotiated, and the Republicans went into high gear. And what did Biden do? He immediately repudiated. He said, "Oh, nobody's going to pay $450,000 to these families. When his own Justice Department had been negotiating, he stopped negotiating and said they shouldn't get anything, and actually now they're fighting the lawsuits just without offering anything. So this is where my ire comes up about Biden. His heart was in the right place to begin with. He said they should be compensated, and as soon as there was some political heat to pay, he just, he should have stood by it and said, Physicians for Human Rights have said that what these families suffered is tantamount to torture. And we've done this, and this is not too much to pay to try to help these families get their lives together. And instead it was like, anyway, my little rant, sorry.
All right, well, I think we'll end there, but thank you all so much for staying, and please keep doing the hard work to make sure that we have a functioning democracy where our votes matter, where we can elect people who have humane policies they want to put in place, as opposed to all this punitive stuff we're seeing that isn't working and isn't making America great. Okay, thank you.